If you're going to start a revolution, I advise that you start with a mirror. You stand before that mirror and like what you see and say to the person staring at you, you and I are going to change the world. We're not going to wait for a mob to join us. We're not going to wait for tomorrow, because we're going to start right now. Thank you.
Most people were never taught the real story. Not about Africa, not about what was taken, and definitely not about what was already there long before anyone else showed up. Dr. John Henrik Clarke didn't hold back when he spoke. He called out the lies, the erasure, and the damage done by people who claimed they came to help. This speech isn't polite, it's honest. And for a lot of people, that honesty still stings. What you're about to hear isn't meant to make anyone comfortable. It's meant to set the record straight.
We cannot talk about Marcus Garvey without talking about the whole of the African world and how the African world relates to the rest of the world. One of the things we have lost most dear to us, that has done the greatest damage to us, we have lost the feeling of ourselves as being a people so important. We stand at the center of the world, and all the world revolves around us. It is hard for us to think of ourselves in that way, but that's the way it is. That silly war in Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East, is indirectly about us, because if it wasn't for certain things that had happened to us, the condition of those nations would be different. They rose up first. They got their first nationhood, their first shaping in world history through the slave trade that rose after the rise of Islam, and they used Islam as the handmaiden for the trade, as the Europeans used Christianity as the handmaiden for their slave trade that lasted 500 years, and that's not over to this day. You have failed to make a connection between yourself and everything that's happening in the world. We have some misconceptions about Marcus Garvey. We have some misconceptions brought into being because certain people want to wash their ego. There are people who said that Marcus Garvey came to America and found black America with a wishbone and gave them a backbone, which is a lie. What you have to do in order to understand Marcus Garvey and his significance is to look at the Caribbean islands 100 years before he was born and look at black America. I will begin by discussing the antecedents of Marcus Garvey. Let's look at the antecedents of Marcus Garvey in the Caribbean islands with major emphasis on Jamaica. Then you can see how it was logical for a Marcus Garvey to emerge. In an island where color consciousness was a prevailing thing, how did this jet black man emerge with no color consciousness toward himself and with no apology for his being? Because he looked back at the revolutionary heritage of the island that gave him birth and the revolutionary heritage of the Caribbean islands itself that had the most successful slave revolts of any African people outside of Africa.
They told us Africa had nothing, that before Europe arrived, there was no order, no progress, no civilization. But that story was never true. Dr. John Henrik Clarke reminded people of what had been buried, not just by colonizers, but by time, by violence, and by shame. In this part of his speech, he said it plainly. Before we talk about Marcus Garvey, before we talk about the movements, we need to understand what the African world was and what it still is underneath the damage. One of the worst things that happened to us wasn't slavery or poverty or war. It was losing our sense of who we are, not as scattered people in different nations, but as one people with a shared foundation. That loss didn't happen all at once. It was chipped away through religion, through education, through control over language and land. Clarke points out something most people don't realize. The African world used to see itself as central. We didn't think we were beneath anyone. That idea had to be taught, forced actually. He brings up what most historians leave out. The Arab slave trade came before the European one, and both used religion as a cover for greed. Islam was used to enslave African people long before Europeans arrived with ships. Christianity later followed the same path, offering salvation on one hand while shoving people into chains with the other. These weren't spiritual missions, they were business operations, and Africa was the target. But what makes Clarke's speech powerful is that he doesn't just blame outsiders, he holds us accountable too. We stopped seeing ourselves clearly. We stopped asking hard questions about what was taken and why. Over time, we stopped connecting what happens to us with what's happening around the world. When countries fall, when borders shift, when wars break out, we often fail to see the role Africa plays. Not as a victim, but as a center of value that everyone else wants to control. Before Garvey rose up, there were already revolts, rebellions, and systems of resistance. Clarke urges people to look back at the Caribbean islands 100 years before Garvey was born, to see the Maroon societies, the slave uprisings, the culture that held African identity intact despite everything meant to erase it. These weren't passive victims. These were communities of people who remembered who they were and who fought to protect it. This is a different way of seeing history, not through the lens of defeat but through survival. African people in the Caribbean didn't just endure slavery, they resisted it. They held on to their languages, their music, their spirituality, their communal values. They passed them down. And they did this even as new colonial governments tried to reshape them into something else, into subjects, into laborers, into tools for someone else's empire. Clarke highlights something that still hits hard today. He talks about the moment when Caribbean people started abandoning that cultural memory, when they began calling themselves Black English, Black French, Black Dutch, anything but African. That shift didn't happen by accident. It was taught, and it worked, because once someone controls your identity, they don't need to control your body anymore. You do the work for them. Marcus Garvey emerged in that aftermath. In a place where colorism was common, where class divisions were sharp, where the idea of being unapologetically African was already being pushed out. That's why his confidence stood out. Clarke emphasizes that Garvey didn't walk around asking for permission to be who he was. He didn't apologize for his skin, his roots, or his mission. He was grounded in something older than the island he came from. He carried the weight of people who had already resisted, already fought, and already lost, but never surrendered. When Clarke talks about the revolutionary heritage of the Caribbean, he's not being nostalgic. He's pointing to something that still matters right now. That heritage was our defense against erasure. It was what kept Black people from becoming tools in someone else's story. The Caribbean was once full of people who knew who they were, who didn't have to check a mirror to find their worth. But when that knowledge fades, what replaces it? In his speech, Clarke makes the case that the biggest mistake we made was trading in our heritage for the appearance of belonging. We took on new flags, new languages, new religions, but we gave up our memory in the process. And without memory, we keep repeating the same cycles, fighting for the wrong goals, arguing over names, dividing ourselves along lines that were drawn for us. This part of the speech doesn't ask for sympathy, it asks for awareness. Clarke's not romanticizing the past. He's explaining how it led to Garvey and why it had to. A man like Garvey doesn't just appear out of nowhere. He is the result of a people pushed to the edge who decided not to fall. He came from communities that survived the worst and still passed on the will to speak, to organize, to lead. If we lose that thread, we lose more than pride. We lose the tools that kept us alive. Clarke reminds us that Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was interrupted. And that interruption wasn't just physical, it was mental, spiritual, generational. The recovery starts when we stop repeating what we were told and start remembering what we already knew. Garvey was a product of memory. He reached into the past to shape a future. But Clarke makes something clear. Memory on its own isn't enough. It has to be defended, carried, protected, and passed on, no matter who tries to silence it.
inasmuch as neither one of us are emancipated to this day, because emancipation, nothing that someone can do for you. It is something either you do for yourself or it is not real. Freedom is something you take with your own hand. You secure it with your own hand. No generation leaves it for another generation. Each generation in its own way, even if it inherits freedom, must secure that freedom all over again with its own strength, its own will, its own hand. And when you forget that and become lax, you have freedom no more. All right, 1850 in the Caribbean islands, the British, the Jamaican colors approached the British. They wanted special privileges, and they were telling the British, if you give us the special privileges, we will protect you from the blacks. And when the British were reluctant to give them special privileges, by 1865, they said, give us these privileges or we're going to join the blacks. Now this accounts for the large number of mulattoes involved in the Moret Bay uprising 1865, and Gordon and other mulattoes who committed themselves to that revolution. Once the British understood this, they gradually began to give these privileges. They began to create a multi-ethnic society based on color, to the point where Jamaica became the most stratified society along color, caste, and economic lines in all the world. Almost as stratified as India with its multiplicity of caste. 70 different definitions of color and caste in Jamaica alone. Special jobs for different people of special gradations of color and hair texture. And this would destabilize the country to the point where the British had an internal army protecting them, and this robbed Jamaica of the privilege that went to Haiti. The Haitian revolts were set in motion by Jamaicans. Jamaicans, troublemakers, that they wanted to get rid of, so they sold them to plantations in Haiti. The Jamaican farmers sold them to plantations in Haiti, and the most noted being Bookman, who decided he's going to be a priest. That he's a priest, and he wasn't going to work on the farm. So as a priest, he began to organize the Yoruba slaves and the solidification of the Haitian Revolution to the point, and he moved it so fast, Toussaint Louverture had to run to catch up with the revolution in order to lead it. And yet, there are two Jamaicans left out of history that helped to set this revolution in motion, Macandel and Bookman. I'm saying that Jamaica forgot its revolutionary heritage. And once a people forget their revolutionary heritage, they come like beggars with an empty cup at the door of a people less than they are, only they don't know that the people are less than they are.
Freedom is never real if someone else gives it to you. That was Dr. John Henrik Clarke's point when he said emancipation is something you take with your own hands. It doesn't matter what papers are signed or what dates are remembered. If you don't protect it, if you don't pass it on properly, it fades. And when that happens, you're no longer free. You're just surviving under a new name for the same old thing. After slavery ended in Jamaica, many believed change had arrived. But the plantations were still there. The landowners were still in charge. The work was still forced, just with a wage so low it made no real difference. Those who were once enslaved had to find their own clothes, their own food, and build shelter for families while still working on the land that had kept them in chains. The system didn't collapse, it adapted. By the 1850s, another pattern emerged. Clarke explains how some mixed-race Jamaicans, the coloreds, tried to carve out space for themselves by getting close to the British rulers. They didn't come with demands for liberation. They came offering a deal. Give us privilege and we'll help control the black population. They weren't seeking justice. They were trying to escape it. When the British hesitated, those same colored elites threatened to switch sides and support the majority black population, unless they got what they asked for. The British responded by granting new layers of status. People were rewarded based on how much they resembled the colonizers. Skin tone, hair texture, and lineage became tools of hierarchy. Over time, Jamaican society was split into dozens of finely graded categories. Your job, your education, your treatment, all of it depended on where you landed on that scale. This wasn't some accident. It was a deliberate move by a colonial system to keep people distracted and divided. Clarke makes the point that Jamaica became one of the most stratified places in the world. There were 70 or more definitions of color. This wasn't just about racism, it was about structure, keeping people in fixed positions so they wouldn't unite. The British didn't have to hold power with violence alone. They turned society itself into a chain. Underneath all of this was something even more painful. Jamaica once had a history of resistance. Clarke doesn't talk about it like folklore. He talks about it as fact. There were Maroons who fought for generations. There were uprisings that shook the plantations. Jamaica was never just an island of victims. It was an island of fighters. But those stories were buried, and that memory was stolen. People were taught to care more about proximity to whiteness than about solidarity with each other. Some of the strongest rebels were cast out. Clarke brings up a name that barely makes it into history books today: Boukman. He was a Jamaican who was considered too dangerous. The British didn't want him around, so he was sold off to a plantation in Haiti. But he didn't disappear. He became a spiritual guide, a leader. And from that role, he helped light the fire of the Haitian Revolution, a revolution that succeeded. Haiti's freedom didn't come from outside. It came from people like Boukman, who organized others and refused to forget who they were. It came from African memory rooted in action. Not nostalgia, but a clear sense of purpose passed from person to person. That kind of memory keeps people alive when the world tries to erase them. Clarke doesn't tell this story to entertain. He's reminding us what happens when history is forgotten. Jamaica had that revolutionary spark, but over time, it was pushed out. Color and class replaced unity. Privilege replaced purpose. And those who once fought became people waiting for approval, people hoping to be chosen, people begging for inclusion in someone else's system. There's no dignity in waiting at the door of power hoping to be let in. That's Clarke's warning. If you don't know your own past, you'll end up copying someone else's future. The moment a people forget their revolutionary roots, they become easier to manage. They stop asking for what's right and settle for what's allowed. They start to believe freedom is something you apply for instead of something you build. This loss didn't just affect Jamaica. It set a pattern for many other places across the African world. The colonizers didn't only control governments, they controlled identity. Once that happens, everything else follows. People begin to see their own features as flaws. They start competing for favor, rather than linking arms in struggle. And when that becomes the norm, real power is gone. There's a reason Clarke keeps returning to the past, not to dwell, but to reconnect. There was a time when people understood the value of heritage, when being African was a source of pride, not something to escape. The further people got from that understanding, the more vulnerable they became to the tricks of empire. Clarke isn't blaming people for trying to survive. He's calling out the systems that taught them survival meant turning against their own. That's the heartbreak at the center of this part of his speech. He saw what was lost. He saw what could have been. And he knew that without memory, liberation is always temporary. He ends this segment with a clear statement. Jamaica forgot its revolutionary heritage. And when that happened, it created a vacuum. In that vacuum, self-worth shrinks, vision disappears, and a whole people, once strong and determined, ends up asking for scraps at the table they built. The lesson isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility. Each generation has to decide whether to reclaim what was stolen or accept whatever is offered. There's no in-between. Clarke spoke these words not as a critic of the people, but as someone who believed we could still recover, if we're willing to look back without flinching and move forward without begging.
Marcus Garvey had told them, look what you see, they don't want us here. Not only let's go home to Africa, let's go home in our own ships. Now the dreamer began to dream the great dream. It was after the First World War. The Secretary of War, Newton D. Baker, had told black Americans that your lot will not be changed by virtue of participating in this war. And to prove that his point, some blacks were lynched in their uniform. We give you nothing. Blacks were not permitted in combat in the American army. John Pershing didn't want them near the battlefield. The French said that I will take all you got. And the blacks who distinguished themselves in battle distinguished themselves under French commander. The Red Cross going to the field to pick up the wounded and the dead left the blacks to die. Du Bois had written an editorial called Close Ranks. Let's forget our difference, let this war be won. And when he went to France and saw the condition, he wanted to take it all back. Close ranks for what? Now, in this atmosphere, 1917 and the Red Summer of 1919, riots all over the country, burning blacks down. Now can you see why it was easy for Marcus Garvey to create the atmosphere and to add to the atmosphere of return, because the country had rejected us, and he was telling us there is a land that is yours. He said the American promise wasn't made to you. The American dream wasn't dreamed for you. I will make you a new promise. I will give you a new dream, and I will give you a new land. That's Africa. 1920, he was to call the largest convention of blacks ever. Old Madison Square Garden, turning back 30,000 people a day, and only 30,000 could fit into the auditorium. Marcus Garvey was doing more than just giving out speeches. This man, with his multifaceted of talent, presented a platform for singers, dancers, musicians. He was creating the semblance of a state. And what we have lost in the world is the idea that we once ruled a state. All of that. During the same time, he would petition Liberia, that sick nation that rejected him and would have been a better nation had they not rejected him. He petitioned them for settlement. 1920, they did not tell him then that they wasn't going to permit him, because these stooges of America, who hadn't changed to this day, lied to Marcus Garvey.
By the end of the First World War, something had shifted. Black men had gone overseas and served in uniforms. They had fought, carried supplies, dug trenches, and returned home expecting even the smallest sign of respect. But instead of gratitude, they came back to fires. Lynch mobs waited for them. Cities turned against them. Uniforms weren't a shield. They were targets. Dr. John Henrik Clarke recalls this moment because it tells you exactly why Marcus Garvey's voice landed the way it did. People weren't looking for promises anymore. They were looking for an escape. East Street Louis, Chicago, and dozens of other cities burned during what came to be known as the Red Summer of 1919. The violence wasn't subtle. Black families were burned out of their homes. Children were killed in the streets. Job lines turned into war zones. The message from white America was clear. There was no place here for black advancement. Garvey saw this and didn't wait for the government to change. He told people the truth. If you aren't wanted here, then stop begging to stay. Go home. Build somewhere else. Build something of your own. Clarke captures the mood of that moment with precision. Garvey wasn't just organizing speeches. He was building an idea people could touch. He proposed ships, not speeches. He wanted roots, not theories. The idea wasn't new, but his timing was sharp. The country had just rejected the very people who had risked their lives to defend it. And Garvey gave them an option they hadn't heard in a long time. Leave this system behind. This wasn't a fantasy. Garvey began buying ships. He launched the Black Star Line. He made it real. He raised the capital. He sent out literature. He organized chapters around the world. Clarke reminds us this wasn't about symbolism. It was logistics. It was a serious effort to create infrastructure for Black people to move, trade, and build internationally. One of the key pieces of Garvey's plan was Liberia, a country that had once been established as a homeland for freed Black Americans, but by this point had become entangled with Western interests. Garvey reached out to Liberia with a proposal. He wanted land. He wanted entry. He wanted to relocate people there, set up farming and industry, and create a true home base for African descendants globally. Clarke doesn't speak gently about what happened next. Liberia said no. Not directly, not at first, but through delay, through dishonesty, and through backdoor agreements. The same country that owed its existence to repatriated Black people shut the door when more Black people wanted to come back. Why? Because they had been compromised. US and European forces leaned on Liberia. They warned the government. They wanted no part in a Black movement that could spread independence and pride, so they blocked it. Clarke calls this what it is, a lie. Garvey wasn't rejected because of poor planning or some error in judgment. He was betrayed. The people in power didn't want him to succeed. They saw what he was building and feared it. Not because it was dangerous to life, but because it was dangerous to the systems that kept Black people dependent. If Garvey had landed in Liberia with skilled tradesmen, builders, teachers, and laborers, all trained, all organized, the world would have changed, and it would have changed fast. That fear wasn't new. Governments had always moved quickly to shut down any serious threat of global Black unity. When Garvey started gaining traction, they responded the same way they always had: surveillance, misinformation, sabotage, and isolation. The plan was never to stop him through debate. It was to tie him down with legal trouble, turn allies against him, and paint his efforts as naive or corrupt. They knew how to destroy something without touching the message. They just broke the machinery. Garvey's ships faced constant obstruction. His organizations were infiltrated, and his attempts to build real partnerships were quietly blocked behind closed doors. Clarke speaks with a deep disappointment here, because this moment could have shifted the direction of African independence by decades. It could have unified the diaspora in ways we still haven't achieved. But it was denied, not by accident, but by design. This isn't just about history, it's a map. Garvey's plan wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was rooted in action. It didn't wait for approval. It didn't rely on favors. And that's what made it dangerous. He didn't ask anyone to save Black people. He told them to save themselves, to leave if necessary, to take control. That kind of leadership is rare, and it's usually punished. Clarke wants us to remember that the rejection of Garvey's vision wasn't a failure of the people. It was a system protecting itself, a system that fears Black mobility, that fears self-reliance, that fears anything it cannot contain. The dream didn't die because it lacked support. It died because it had too much power. Today, the lessons still hold. The system hasn't changed much. It still promises acceptance, but only if you stay in your place. It still offers symbols, but rarely delivers power. Garvey's idea that you can build something of your own, that you can live on your own terms, still threatens that order, which means it's still worth revisiting. Clarke's voice in this moment doesn't just honor Garvey, it challenges us. What are we building? Who are we waiting on? And how long before we realize the path forward was laid out a century ago? If you learned something today, share it. These stories deserve more than silence. Hit that like button to help others find it, and subscribe if you want more history that doesn't skip the hard parts. We break it down, we keep it real, and we bring voices back that were never meant to be forgotten. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.